Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Now we're going to be taking a look at another twisted case with you, the ordered family murder case shook Norway in 1999 when Christian ordered his wife Marie and their daughter and were brutally killed at their farm. Join us in this video as we dive deep into the investigation to uncover the truth behind this heartbreaking crime. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved Christian, Marie and ordered, and all those affected by this case. The father and the mother of the ordered family were Christian and Marie. In April 1952 they welcomed their eldest and only daughter. In 2 years later a son joined the family. Christian ran the ordered family farm, which they also called home, located about 80 miles from Oslo, Norway. The farm had a main house, an additional house and a barn. The main house was quite spacious and sat close to the edge of the woods. The barn was just a short distance away. The second house was sitting on a hill which overlooked the farm. An emperor grew up working on the farm, embracing the rural lifestyle, but as they grew older Anna began to wish for different futures for themselves. Although Anne was the eldest and loved the farm, she didn't see it as her future. She wanted to leave and make a life of her own, and eventually moved to Oslo, where she married a man coincidentally named Per, just like her brother. To avoid confusion we will address Anne's husband Per as husband Per. Now Anne and her husband Per lived in Oslo, which is the capital of Norway. They were a successful and joyful couple who both worked for the government and worked as the personal secretary for the Norwegian defense minister at the Ministry of Defense, while her husband Per was a well-respected high-level diplomat for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Their lives in the big crowded city were completely different from the quiet and rural life Anne had known on the family farm. While it seemed like Anne achieved her dreams in Oslo, her brother Per had always known that his future was on the family farm. Unlike Anne, Per didn't want to leave at all. He had worked on the farm since he was little and made it clear to his parents that he wanted to take it over when Per turned 30. Christian retired, paving the way for Per to take on more responsibility. Although Christian still technically owned the farm, the plan was for Per to eventually buy it from him after they retired. Christian and his wife Marie moved from the main house to the second home, which allowed Per to move into the main house and manage the farm more efficiently. This house, located very close to the barn, was perfect for running the farm operations. About 10 years later, when brother Per was 40, he met and married a 21-year-old woman named Veronica, who then moved into the main house with him. Together they continued to work on the farm, maintaining the family legacy. Meanwhile, over in Oslo, strange things began happening to Anne and her husband Per. Their once peaceful and successful lives started to be filled with strange occasions, mysterious phone calls, unexplained disturbances at their home, and a growing sense of being watched made their days more tense each day. The two had no idea why it was all happening and who was behind all this. Then on March 3, 1997, at about 1:30 a.m., after an evening out with friends and her husband Per were assaulted by a random man on the sidewalk. The man threw Per to the ground and started kicking him, then turned his attention to Anne and also hit her repeatedly. After a few intense moments the assailant walked away, leaving both Anne and Per injured but alive. Strangely, the man didn't steal anything, he just attacked them. A few months later, on either July 15 or 17, Anne found a weird-looking device taped to the underside of her car. The car, which belonged to the Ministry of Defense, looked normal on the outside, but something in Anne told her that something was off. Despite the strange-looking tube attached underneath, she drove to work and parked outside the Ministry of Defense building in Oslo, unsure of what the object was, and eventually reported it to the Oslo police later that day. Their investigation revealed a chilling discovery: the device was over half a kilo of dynamite less than a month later. On August 12, 1998, another unsuccessful assassination attempt occurred at their Oslo apartment in the middle of the night. Per woke up to the smell of gas. He also heard a hissing noise coming from outside the front door. When he opened the door, he discovered a 5-kilo gas tank with its vent open left just outside. The tubing from the tank was placed near a crack in the building's front, which allowed gas to leak inside. The setup was obviously designed to fill their apartment with gas, but thankfully PER's quick response prevented the disaster. Police also found a trail of gasoline leading from the street to the front door. The setup could have caused a major explosion, but thankfully no one had ignited it. Despite the publicity surrounding these events, no arrests were made in connection with the assassination attempts. Concerned for their safety, the police moved Per and Ann to a secure location at a military camp. At that point, Per and Ann began to seriously fear for their lives. As a result, on the 3rd of September 1998, Per and Ann decided to move to New York. They stayed there for 4 months, with Per working as a consul general. In January 1999, feeling a renewed sense of safety, they decided to return home to Oslo. Confident that the threat had passed, they refused further police protection, but despite their near misses with death, danger continued to lurk, waiting for another opportunity to hit. The murders on May 6, 1999. Ann's husband Per passed away after a battle with cancer. Speculation arose whether his death might have been caused by someone who wanted him dead, possibly through exposure to a toxin or poison that led to his illness, but no concrete evidence has ever supported this theory. Just 9 days after Per's death on May 15, 1999, a man called Norway's emergency number 180 and threatened them, saying that Ann and her parents were targeted for murder. The police were called in response to the threats, but despite efforts they couldn't identify the caller. On May 23, 1999, Christian's brother Hans arrived at the family farm to visit but received no response. At the front door of his brother's house, concerned, he walked around to the back and found broken glass from a door on the second-floor balcony. Then he knew something was very wrong. Entering the house, Hans made a horrifying discovery. There were 3 bodies, all victims of close-range gunshots. 81-year-old Christian had been shot while in bed. 84-year-old Marie was found in the living room in her nightgown, and aged 47 lay on the kitchen floor, also in her nightgown. Hans then called the police, who quickly arrived at the scene to investigate the triple murder. They found that the assailant had entered through the smashed back door. Upon further examination, it was revealed that Christian and Marie had been sleeping in the main bedroom, which was located on the second floor of the house. The police began piecing together the events leading up to the tragic deaths of Christian, Marie, and Ann. As the community grappled with the shock and grief of losing 3 beloved members of the Udar family, Christian suffered 2 gunshot wounds, initially from a .38 caliber and then a .22, which led to suspect more than one perpetrator. He appeared to have been attempting to retrieve a shotgun from the primary bedroom closet for defense, but was fatally shot before he could do so. Marie was shot in the chest with the .38 and managed to escape from the bedroom to the living room, where she was shot again with the .38 caliber, and who had been staying in the basement likely rushed upstairs. Upon hearing the gunshots, she was found on the kitchen floor near the door leading outside, indicating she may have been attempting to escape the house during the attack. The investigation in addition to the tragic details of the murders, police discovered several key pieces of evidence at the scene. They found multiple spent shell casings from 2 different guns inside the house, which suggested there were at least 2 perpetrators involved. The smashed door revealed a partial shoe print on the broken glass, meaning that the assailants forcefully entered the home. Outside the house, police came across a yellow or orange hand-knit wool sock. Their working theory was that the murderers had worn socks over their shoes to prevent leaving identifiable shoe prints. Finding The sock outside suggested that it might have slipped off one of the perpetrators before they entered the house. From the outset of the investigation, police strongly suspected that the victims knew their killer or killers. The absence of any stolen items from the house eliminated robbery as a motive with the backdrop of previous assassination attempts. Police focused on the likelihood that Anne was the main target. Police reasoned that the perpetrator must have been aware of Anne's visit to her parents that weekend, a detail known only to someone familiar with the family's schedule. Their first interview focused on the only remaining member of the family, who happened to reside just 200 meters away in the main house on the night of the murders, but Per and Veronica claimed they heard nothing during the night of the murders, despite the discovery of over 12 gunshots and multiple shell casings. This immediately drew suspicion from the police. Additional reports surfaced that their cars were not at the farm that night, along with the absence of their dogs, as noted by a neighbor who rented property on the farm. These factors quickly placed Per and Veronica under scrutiny as prime suspects in the investigation as the police delved deeper into the motive behind the ordered family murders. They uncovered unsettling details that contradicted the quiet image of farm life. The last attempts on Anne's life suggested someone with a motive against her, possibly related to personal or professional reasons linked to her high-profile government position. If Per actually committed the murders, his alleged involvement might have stemmed from deep-seated hatred or motives related to internal family dynamics, but again, these are only allegations. Another point that drew attention was Christian and Per wished to sell the farm after retiring. Christian and Marie planned to transfer ownership to Per, eventually allowing him to manage day-to-day operations in the meantime, but Christian still had ownership to give financial responsibility to his son rather than simply gifting him the property. Tensions escalated when Christian discovered tax returns indicating that Per had listed himself as the owner of the farm despite the ownership not yet formally transferring. This discovery deeply troubled Christian, as he felt betrayed by what he perceived as dishonesty from his son and a breach of their agreement. And it got worse from then on. As a result, Christian decided to hire a lawyer and raise the price for Per to officially buy the family farm. Christian also believed that the farm was not being run effectively, which added to his frustrations for Anne. Though things were different, being the oldest sibling, she stood to inherit the farm if something happened to their parents. The financial disputes between Christian and Per over the family farm escalated into a bitter conflict. Their disagreement became so heated that they stopped communicating with each other for a year. Per took legal action against his father, suing him over the agreed upon price of the farm. Initially, the court ruled in Per's favor, citing a signed contract that established the price, but Christian found the decision unfair and appealed to overturn it, claiming that he had never signed any such documents. Subsequent investigation revealed that Per had forged his father's signature on the papers presented to the court. As a result, the original court's decision was reversed, dealing a blow to Per legal claims and worsening the relationship between the two. After all these findings, the police investigation into the Udar family murders began to focus sharply on Per as a primary suspect. The discovery of his disputes with Christian over the farm's management, ownership and pricing, compounded by Anne's plans to potentially divide and sell parts of the property, provided a clear motive for Per. Anne's intentions to sell parts of the farm threatened Per's vision of inheriting and maintaining the property as a whole. These revelations supported the police theory that Per had a solid motive to kill his family members, including Anne, who posed a direct threat to his perceived rightful ownership of the farm. As the investigation deepened, suspicions turned towards Per's wife Veronica, in the middle of the allegations from her ex-boyfriend, suggesting she was motivated by financial gain given the significant age gap between her and Per. Meanwhile, a bizarre incident occurred just 10 days after the murders, when police responded to reports of gunshots in a nearby wooded area. There they saw Kristen Kirkamo, Veronica's sister, doing Target practice. Given Christine's relation to Veronica, police interrogated her and grew increasingly suspicious. During the questioning, this led to obtaining a search warrant for the residence Kristen shared with her boyfriend Lars. Inside, police discovered incriminating evidence, such as drugs, explosives and multiple firearms, including a .22 caliber gun. Although the .22 caliber gun found did not match the murder weapon used in the ordered family killings, forensic analysis revealed that the bullets recovered from the crime scene were of the same type as those fired from this particular .22 caliber gun. With Lars now also under suspicion, the murder investigation expanded to include 4 suspects. The unfolding statements from Kristen and Lars were a whole different story. Kristen implicated Lars, mentioning his ownership of a .38 caliber gun named Small Boy, which had mysteriously disappeared. She claimed they had supplied guns to Per and Veronica and helped in planning the murders, but insisted they were not present during the shootings. In contrast, Lars admitted to providing guns to Per and Veronica, but firmly denied any knowledge or involvement in a murder conspiracy. As detectives delved deeper, conflicting accounts emerged from Kristen, Lars, and their acquaintances regarding their whereabouts on the night of the shootings. At that moment, it was clear that they were hiding something. The police's discovery of shell casings matching those found at the murder scene linked directly to the crime. At first, Lars had claimed he sold his .38 caliber gun but admitted to using it for target practice in the woods. Police located the exact spot where Lars had fired the gun and found shell casings that matched those recovered from the ordered family murder scene. Meanwhile, in the middle of the ongoing investigation, a funeral and church service were held in June or July 1999 to mourn the 3 victims. Per, despite being under suspicion, attended the funeral for his family members and was visibly overcome with grief and was seen shedding tears and mourning for his lost loved ones. Sentencing on June 22, 2001, both Per and Veronica Ordered along with Kristen Kirkemo were found guilty on all charges and received sentences of 21 years in prison, but Per and Veronica appealed their convictions, claiming they were innocent. But in April 2002, Per-Ored's appeal resulted in the confirmation of his 21-year prison sentence along with the loss of his inheritance rights to the family farm. Veronica Ordered also received a 21-year prison sentence upon appeal. Kristen Kirkemo's sentence was reduced to 16 years in prison during the appeals process. Meanwhile, Lars Grunner, though initially sentenced to 2.5 years for illegal weapons charges, saw his sentence increase to 18 years following an appeal by the prosecuting authority, which argued that his original punishment was too light. The aftermath: the Ordered family murder case, especially the convictions of Per and Veronica Ordered, Kristen Kirkemo and Lars Grunner for their alleged roles as accessories to the murders, gets media attention to this day. Despite their convictions, none of the defendants were charged with actually committing the murders due to insufficient evidence linking them directly to the shootings. Since their convictions, Per and Veronica have maintained their innocence, even hiring private investigators to uncover new evidence that they claim clears them. In a significant development, in 2018, a witness reportedly tied Lars Grunner to the threatening call made to emergency services in 1999, suggesting a potential new lead in the case. The timing of this revelation, coming 20 years after the incident, raised questions about the witness's motivations and the credibility of the new information. In their efforts to clear their names, Per and Veronica formally filed to reopen the case, presenting over 1,000 pages of material and 28 videos of evidence to a state commission tasked with evaluating the potential for reopening criminal investigations. Their investigator claims that this new evidence proves them innocent. Story 2. Now we're going to be taking a look at another twisted case with you. In this bone-chilling familicide case, we We'll explore how and why David Brum slaughtered his picture-perfect family with an axe at just 16 years of age. Love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved Bernard Plett, Diane and Richard Brum, and all those affected by this case. David Francis Brum was born on October 3, 1971 to Plett in Bernard Brum in Cascade Township, Minnesota. He was the second child in what would become a family of 6. His older brother Joseph Leonard Brum, known as Joe, was born on June 24, 1969. David's parents then welcomed their first daughter Diane on April 10, 1974. And their third son Richard, known as Ricky, on July 25, 1976. Not much is publicly known about David's upbringing in early life, but he was a good student in high school. His attendance was excellent, his grades were solid B+, and he had positive relationships with his teachers. His Spanish teacher described him as an above-average student, saying he was pleasant, quiet, and they got along well. There were no signs or forewarnings at school indicating what would happen on February 18, 1988, but David's life at home told a different story. He had been suffering from progressive depression, which had emerged over several years and got worse and worse. Medical records show that this even led him to develop suicidal thoughts to cope with his declining mental health. David tried to mask his pain by making others around him happy. This facade fooled everyone at school, where he was seen as the class clown, always jumping about and saying witty or entertaining things. But in 1987, David attempted to take his own life twice. The first suicide attempt occurred at the end of David's 9th grade year. In June 1987, when he was only 16 years old, he tried to hang himself from a tree in the forest near his home, but changed his mind at the last minute. The second attempt happened towards the end of that summer. In September, David overdosed on 45 sleeping pills which he had gotten from a girl who used them for a sleeping disorder. After taking the pills, David got very sick and vomited, telling his parents he had the flu, which they believed. He was deeply serious about ending his life during the second attempt, and later felt extremely disappointed that it had failed. David's depression and suicidal thoughts stemmed from a troubled relationship with his family, particularly his father Bernard. These familial issues got much worse after David's brother Joe left. Joe had begun dressing in a punk style with heavy eyeliner and dark clothes, and his parents hated it. After many arguments about Joe's appearance and lifestyle, his parents eventually kicked him out of the house. Following Joe's eviction, Bernard and Plett imposed even stricter rules and discipline on David and his younger siblings, seemingly in an attempt to prevent them from adopting a similar lifestyle. The Brum family, David's family, was middle class and financially comfortable and were well respected within their local community. Both parents were very careful about how they are perceived and did not want to be associated with any lifestyle or ideology that might tarnish their reputation. They had a strict curfew, which meant David and his siblings had to do household chores, and they allegedly punished them if they did not do it. While it's not confirmed, there are allegations that David's parents would hit him and his siblings and punish them if they did not do their chores quickly or to their satisfaction. David always sought his father's approval and validation, but found it impossible to achieve the stricter discipline and the pressure to conform to his parents' standards added to his already unstable mental health. The struggle for acceptance and the increasingly tense home environment must have affected David's deepening depression and deteriorating mental state significantly. David's father Bernard was an engineer at the IBM plant, while his mother Pet had run a preschool program at their local church until she quit a couple of years before 1988 to spend more time with her kids. Known in the community for her sewing skills and creativity, Pet was a well-regarded figure and everyone seemed to like her. The entire family except Joe went every Sunday without fail to Pax Christi Catholic Church. The parents even hosted several church meetings at their home with Bernard using his home computer almost for church work. From the outside, the Broom family was seen as a model family. Respected and admired within the community, the local pastor described David's parents as quiet leaders of the church, well respected by everyone. Neighbors also said there was no indication that something was wrong in the family, but despite this appearance, David silently struggled with serious emotional problems. He believed no adult would understand or take his issues seriously. Along with his thoughts of suicide, a dark seed began to grow in the back of David's mind, a seed that would soon take over with thoughts of murdering his family. David never directly shared these thoughts with his friends, but he hinted at them through a disturbing fantasy about a trip to Florida. He told one friend that in the summer of 1988 he wanted to take a van and go to Florida, where he planned to kill his parents. He also mentioned wanting to take a couple of girls with him, but he didn't specify who, and said he wanted to kill them too. At the time, his friend dismissed these statements as a sick joke, not something to be taken seriously. In another version of this fantasy, David would kill his family, steal the van and money, and drive to Florida. There he and two friends would live it up until they ran out of money, at which point David planned to end his life. A classmate later described this plan, saying that David himself and another friend, Angie, had a sort of vacation fantasy. They would add elements to make it more exciting, discussing how they would get to Florida live off the money they had, get an apartment and have fun. David said they could get a car by him killing his family. He would then call IBM to inform them of a death in the family, so his father would be taking off a few weeks, ensuring no one would be looking for them. These conversations seemed like harmless at worst daydreams to his friends, but they reflected the darker intentions in David's mind, intentions that would eventually lead to tragedy. Patty Price. Before the incident, Patty Price, who grew up with the Brown family, was at the Brown house for a sleepover. Diane Brown, David's sister, had her desk next to Patty's in their homeroom, where 4 desks were pushed together on the Thursday of that week. Diane didn't show up for school, and it raised some concern among their classmates and teachers because her parents hadn't called in her absence. Rick, Diane's 5th grade brother, was also missing from school, which was unusual since Mrs. Brown, a stay-at-home mom, was typically strict about such things. That evening, Patty went about her day as usual. Her mom was the 8th grade math teacher at her school, and she was laying in the living room that night, working on algebra with her dad because her mom refused to help with math homework. The atmosphere at Patty's home was calm, which was a direct contrast to what was happening at the Brown household at that time. That Thursday evening, a phone call came in after 8 o'clock, which was unusual in 1988. Patty's mom answered the phone, and it quickly became clear that something was very wrong. Normally a composed person, her mom started crying, which was an unusual and terrifying sound. Patty felt her body stiffen with dread as she sensed the gravity of the situation, and she just couldn't get words out at first, and she said, "Patty, you're going to die. I don't know how to tell you this, but Diane's dead." My body went from being stiff to being stiffer, and my dad's body completely stiffened around me as well. From that moment forward, it was like a dark cloud had surrounded me, and I couldn't move, and I did move. I got up. My only sister at home at the time was a senior in high school, and my grandma lived with us at the time too. All I remember about the rest of that night is we found out the whole family was found murdered. David was missing. David was like an older brother to me. When her mom finally managed to speak, she struggled to get the words out. "Patty, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice breaking. "Diane is dead." Patty's body went from stiff to completely paralyzed with shock. Her dad was lying beside her, who was also tensed up. Her oldest sister, a high school senior, and her grandma were also at home that night. The family learned that the entire Brum family had been murdered and David was missing. David, who had been like an older brother to Patty, had just gone cross-country skiing with her, and Diane. The previous Sunday he was a super nice kid, which made the news even more baffling. The next morning Patty went to school and walking into St. Pius felt surreal, like entering a ghost town. Everyone was eerily quiet. Patty first passed Ricky's 5th grade classroom where she saw people but heard nothing. In the 8th grade hallway, Diane's chair was still on her desk, placed there by the cleaners. Patty and another friend cleaned out Diane's desk. As for David, Patty was convinced he had either been kidnapped or had escaped, not yet knowing the full extent of the horror that had unfolded that morning. David told a friend that he had killed his family. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but his friends always thought he was joking, never imagining he could actually do something so terrible. But the police were called after the rumor reached the school staff. When they arrived at the Broom family house, the scene they encountered was beyond words, a horror that defied description. Olmsted County Sheriff Kevin Turson, who was a deputy at the time, often reflects on his 34-year career in law enforcement, with no case more impactful than February 18, 1988. With only 4 years of experience, 2 of which were in Rochester, he was dispatched to perform a welfare check at the Broom home. As the sun set around 5:23 p.m., Turson decided to wait for his backup before proceeding. Once his partner arrived, they knocked at the door, but there was no response. Turson and his partner carefully proceeded up the stairs. At the top he saw the feet of 2 females lying on the floor. The sight confirmed their worst fears. As he stepped into Ricky's room, he found Ricky laying in bed in a fetal position with severe head injuries and multiple other wounds, clutching a small blanket. But how and why did he do it? I've got all the snapshots still in my head, and they're there, and the sensations, the smell, the different thoughts and sounds that I was experiencing, and they're right here. They have never gone away. The murders on the evening of Wednesday, February 17, 1988. At around 11:30 p.m. David was hanging out in his bedroom when his father Bernard walked in and started threatening him. In the last few months, David had become more invested in the punk and heavy metal scene and even had a music collection. It was this collection that Bernard threatened to take away if David didn't change his attitude. Whether this was related to the lifestyle David was delving into or due to an incident about David's attitude earlier that day is unclear. During this heated conversation, Bernard pushed David, causing him to fall backward onto a table. Overcome with fear and petrified of being struck again, David fled the room. At some point between 1:30 a.m. and 3:00 a.m. on Thursday, February 18, David called a friend he had spoken to about the Florida trip and asked if she would skip school the next day if he were to murder his parents. That night, after making the call, David returned to his bedroom and began listening to music. Again, during this time he thought heavily about his situation and feelings, thinking about all the consequences. Before murdering his entire family at about 3:00 a.m., David left his bedroom and headed towards the garage, tiptoeing through the family home, careful not to cause any noise that might wake his family. When David reached the garage, he carefully picked up a long-handled axe. At some point he also picked up a steak knife. Armed with both, he entered the room where his parents were peacefully sleeping. David claimed he did not remember hitting anyone, but did recall a lot of screaming, not just from his victims but also from himself. The aftermath: afterwards, David was in his room packing things like blankets. All the lights were on and he had to go into each room. His brother was in his bedroom and his mother and sister in the hall, with blood everywhere. David then called a friend immediately after the slaying and confessed everything to her. In just a matter of moments, David had murdered his father Bernard Broom, who was 41 years old, his mother Plett Broom, who was also 41 years old, his little brother Richard, known as Ricky, who was 11 years old, and his little sister Diane, who was 13 years old. David left the axe, the murder weapon, near the bottom of the basement stairs as he packed up his things at about 3:30 a.m. Shortly after Committing the murders, David tried to phone another friend but hung up when his friend's father answered at some point afterwards. David took the family's van and drove to a local bank where he withdrew money using his mother's bank card. He then drove to a local supermarket where he bought cigarettes and snacks. Following this, David drove to a spot overlooking his friend's house so he could see when she left for school in the morning. When he saw her, she asked her to skip school. The two then drove to a nearby park where they hung out for a short while before driving to the bank, where David withdrew more money. In the middle of the night on February 18, 1988, 16-year-old David Brum killed four of his family members: his parents Bernard and Plett, and younger siblings 14-year-old Diane and 9-year-old Rick. All murdered with an axe. After leaving the park, David and his friend went to the friend's house where the friend shaved the sides of David's head. The hair shaving didn't go well, so they decided to go to Kmart to purchase a razor. When they returned, David's friend finished the punk haircut David wanted, shaving the sides and creating a design with lines in the back. Shortly after, David had to hide in the friend's closet when the friend's mother unexpectedly came home. Once she left, the friend went back to school and David drove to a different school where he met other friends for lunch. During lunch, he convinced one of these friends to dye his hair. The first attempt failed, so David went back to his family home to try again. The home, still containing the bodies of his murdered family, was where he dyed his hair. Downstairs, after dyeing his hair, David met up with another friend to return a book bag and said he was in deep trouble. He mentioned that he planned to sleep under a bridge that night and walk to the Twin Cities in the morning at 5:23 p.m. Concerned neighbors of the Brum family called the police and requested a welfare check. Following the call, two officers went to the Brum family home. They arrived shortly before 6:00 p.m. and found the front door closed but not locked. As they entered the house, they called out into the silence, but no one answered. When they made their way towards the stairs to the second floor, they were confronted with a gruesome scene. The entire Brum family was slaughtered except for the eldest son Joe and David. A quick examination of the bodies revealed they were in a state of rigor mortis, which meant they had been dead for longer than 12 hours. Subsequently, the police issued a nationwide alert for David. They tracked down Joe Brum, the eldest sibling, who was working as a cook at a local restaurant, and informed him of his family's deaths, but David was nowhere to be seen. In the meanwhile, David was actually sighted by one of his teachers at a local shopping center that evening. The family's van, which David had been driving, was found by the authorities at about 11 p.m. near a Methodist hospital. David spent the night of that Thursday in a culvert near his home at about 8:30 a.m. on Friday, February 19, 1988. A citizen saw David using a payphone at a post office and reported him to the police. He was then arrested inside the post office and brought in for questioning. The trial, as David was 16 years old at the time of his arrest. He was initially charged in the juvenile justice system. However, after a hearing, he was referred to be prosecuted as an adult. Remember the reports. The question Olmsted County authorities must decide now is whether to charge David Brum as a juvenile or as an adult. Watch the Brum family murder story play out on national television. Good evening. Topic: tonight's news. 11 police charged a 16-year-old boy with 4 counts of first-degree murder after his family has found axed to death in their Rochester home. The trial had 2 phases as required by Minnesota law. The first phase focused on determining whether David was guilty of first or second-degree murder in relation to the deaths of his parents and siblings. During this phase of David's trial, the defense sought to introduce expert psychiatric testimony to see if David was mentally fit, but the trial court denied this request, and as a result the defense rested its case without presenting any testimony. The jury was told not to consider evidence of David's mental illness during Phase 1 deliberations. Despite this, the jury found David guilty of 4 counts of First-degree murder. Moving to phase 2 of the trial, David had to prove his legal insanity as the evidence was too strong. The defense presented testimony from a psychiatrist who concluded that David did not understand that killing his parents and siblings was wrong at the time of the murders and argued he was legally insane. On the other hand, the state countered with testimony from 4 psychiatrists. 2 of these experts said that David was not legally insane during the murders, while the other 2 did not offer an opinion on his legal mental illness. All the experts agreed that David suffered from some form of mental illness or impairment, and even the psychiatrist who testified for the prosecution acknowledged that David was mentally ill and suggested that David may have killed his family to avoid committing suicide. David's older brother Joe had a verified alibi for the day of the murders, and forensic analysis revealed palm prints on the murder weapon matching David's prints. The trial concluded with Broom receiving 3 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 52 years before parole eligibility. Good evening. David Broom is guilty. The jury reaffirmed its earlier decision and found Broom was sane when he killed his parents' younger brother and sister with an axe, and that story tops tonight's News 11. The jury deliberated more than 21 hours over 3 days before reaching the second verdict shortly before noon today. Today's guilty verdict comes 20 months after the bodies of Brom's family were found in their suburban Rochester home, and ends one of Minnesota's most publicized trials. The case involving David Brom's murders still had attention months later, with speculation circulating about the possible influence of Negative Land, a Bay Area music group known for their satirical and critical content. Negative Land's music addresses topics such as mass media, nuclear war, and handguns, often using humor to convey their messages, but their song "Christianity is Stupid" became an important point of investigation as the police wondered whether it sparked a dispute among the Broom family, potentially contributing to the tragic murders. Negative Land members expressed disbelief that their music, intended as satire, could have played any role in such a serious and tragic event. They were cooperative with federal authorities, who requested the group cancel their planned tour and refrain from live performances until the investigation concluded. Story 3. Now we're going to be taking a look at another twisted case with you. A well-respected woman in their close-knit community, 30-year-old mom of 2 Rachel O'Reilly, was mysteriously found dead in her house in 2004 after failing to pick up her son from school. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved Rachel O'Reilly and all those affected by this case. Rachel O'Reilly was born on October 10, 1973, to a young Teresa Lowe, just 17 at the time. Teresa, feeling too young to raise a child, made the heart-wrenching decision to give Rachel up for adoption. Rachel was taken in by Rose Call-Alley, who welcomed her into a warm and cozy home that eventually included 5 adopted siblings. The Calley family was incredibly close-knit, and they always made time for each other. Rachel had 3 brothers, Anthony, Declan, and Paul, and a sister named Anne. She was an athletic girl full of energy and was also known for her love of softball. Described as a live wire with a kind heart, Rachel was a bright ray of sunshine in her family. Rose fondly remembered her as an adventurous child who threw herself into everything she could, while her father Jim praised her independence and love for decorating. At 17, Rachel met Joe O'Reilly at the department store where they both worked. Joe was 2 years older and was surprised by Rachel's height. She stood at 5 feet 11 inches. Just a few inches shorter than his 6 feet 5 inches frame. Despite Joe's repeated attempts to ask her out, Rachel initially turned him down, but Joe kept trying and trying. Joe, eager to win Rachel over, found out she played softball and one day turned up at her practice session and joined her team. Both of them excelled and even had the potential to turn professional. Their bond soon grew into a romantic relationship. At the top of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, Joe proposed to Rachel, and a couple of years later they got married. They welcomed 2 sons and moved to their new home, a bungalow called Lama View in Null in 2003. It was the perfect place to raise their children, and Rachel loved being a mother and dedicated everything she did to her boys. Joe O'Reilly also came from a close family as the second eldest of 2 boys and 2 girls, but his childhood was different. His parents' marriage fell apart when he was young and his father moved to England. Despite this, Joe was incredibly confident and determined to succeed in the advertising industry. Although he did not have the formal qualifications, his persuasive nature and confidence with clients made up for it. He was known for getting to work early and leaving late, all for success. When Rachel and Joe moved into their 3-bedroom bungalow, Rachel's stepmother Rose had some concerns. She worried that Rachel might feel lonely as Joe's work kept him away from home so often. Despite this, Rachel seemed happy with the move. She quickly became well known in the area, selling Avon and Tupperware. On Monday, October 4, 2004, around 5:30 a.m., Joe O'Reilly left the family home to go to work at Viacom Outdoor Advertising in the Bluebell Industrial Estate, where he was an account manager. Later that morning, Joe sent Rachel a message saying, "You and the boys sleep okay? Wish Jackie a happy birthday for me, please, kiss kiss." But he received no reply. Between 11:52 a.m. and 1:45 p.m. Joe left Rachel several voicemails. At 1:15 p.m. Joe got a call from their son's daycare which told him that Rachel did not pick up their son at 12:30. As usual, concerned, Joe called Rachel's phone and left a message asking if someone else was supposed to pick up their son. He called again at 1:24, telling her he was worried and asking her to call him back, but still received no response. He began ringing Rachel and she didn't answer the phone. Joe set off to get their sons and called his mother-in-law Rose, explaining that he hadn't heard from Rachel all morning and that both the home phone and her mobile were unanswered. He asked Rose to go to their home to check on Rachel. As he drove down the motorway, Joe called Rachel's phone again, telling her he had spoken to Rose, who also hadn't heard from her, and begged her to call him back. Joe then phoned Rachel's youngest brother Anthony to tell him that he hadn't heard from Rachel and that she had missed picking up their son from daycare. Family members tried calling Rachel's home phone in mobile, but all the calls went unanswered. Rose had a feeling that something was seriously wrong. This was not like Rachel, so she set off to check on her daughter. When she pulled up at the bungalow, she felt a brief sense of relief upon seeing Rachel's car in the driveway and the patio door open, but the house was eerily silent. The kitchen drawers were open and items were scattered across the floor in the living room. Videos were dumped in a pile, making it look like the house had been robbed. When Rose reached Rachel and Joe's bedroom, she found her daughter's lifeless body. Rachel was lying on her back in a pool of blood, the upper half of her body twisted. There was so much blood that Rose couldn't tell if Rachel's face was on its side or face down. Blood covered the walls and ceiling, and there was even blood spatter in the bathroom. When Rose touched her, she felt Rachel was as cold as marble. A neighbor later recalled hearing Rose's screams. Rose ran to her bag to get her phone and called the Gardaí, the Irish police. She then called one of her sons, Declan, to tell him the news. Declan said he was coming home, and so was Jim, Rose's husband. Joe arrived at the house at 2:30 with the children and was informed about what happened. Joe ran into the house shouting Rachel's name. Rachel's best friend Jackie, who was a nurse, also came to the house. She checked Rachel and confirmed there was no pulse and she wasn't breathing. Rachel's father Jim soon arrived, but was told by a Gardaí not to go inside due to the horrifying scene. When the first guard arrived, Joe approached them in the garden. He explained that he had been in the house and touched Rachel's body to check for a pulse, and mentioned that Joe had moved a box near where Rachel's body lay into the boys' room and was worried that he might have destroyed evidence. Joe told the guard he had an alibi. He had been at a bus depot in Broadstone. It seemed unlikely he could have traveled all the way to the house and back in the given time frame. Rachel's father Jim said that Rachel would have fought for her life with everything she had. He believed the killer attacked her from behind, although it didn't initially appear to be a robbery gone wrong. One thing stood out immediately: there was money in the home that hadn't been taken. €800 in a box in the kitchen and €400 in Rachel's bag. The police didn't believe this was a random attack carried out by a stranger. The brutality of the assault indicated a deep hatred. Whoever did it, they planned all of it way before I made my way outside, the superintendent said to me. What did you see in there? I said I saw two things. And he said, what? I said, firstly, it wasn't a burglary. Correct, he said, and he says, what's the second thing? Well, I said, whoever done this to this lady hated her. I said, there's a hate and a viciousness in what I seen down there. He says, correct, an incident room was set up at the station and over 40 officers were dispatched to do door-to-door questioning and search the local area for potential clues based on the crime scene. The guardy believed Rachel had been caught totally off guard by the attack. Searches for the murder weapon were conducted, but nothing was found. Instead, the searchers discovered something more interesting. Half a mile away from the house, a plastic bag was found containing jewelry and a camera. Two items Joe had said were missing. At that point, it was looking less and less like a burglary. That evening, Joe was questioned. He said he left for work as usual and headed to the gym beforehand. CCTV footage showed him leaving work at 8 a.m. walking towards a bus depot in Broadstone where his colleague was supposed to meet him. Part of Joe's job was checking advertisements on buses, which meant he had to travel around quite often. At 8:45 a.m. Dear Rick set off and called Joe upon arriving at the depot, asking where he was. Joe replied he was in another part of the depot. Dear Rick confirmed he had spoken to Joe on the phone when he arrived, and Joe had said he was there, just in a different part of the site at the time Dear Rick had that call. He didn't know Rachel had been murdered. The guard carrying out a preliminary investigation outside the house where the remains of a mother of two were found this afternoon. State pathologist Dr. Mary Cassidy was called to the scene after the discovery. During the questioning, the police asked Joe if anyone was known to dislike Rachel or if she had been seeing someone else romantically. In response, Joe said none of them were having an affair, but the guard hadn't asked if Joe was having an affair, so why did Joe feel the need to clarify that he wasn't? This odd statement raised suspicions, and soon the truth came out. Joe himself was having an affair. He eventually admitted he had a brief fling with a woman named Nikki, insisting it wasn't serious. He mentioned that he had told Rachel 3 times that he wasn't having an affair. The couple had argued the day before she was killed, and Joe had slept in the spare room the day after Rachel was found. Nikki was questioned by the police and confirmed the relationship, but also claimed it wasn't serious. That same day, the guard received Rachel's post-mortem results. It revealed she had been bludgeoned with a heavy object such as a dumbbell, which was one of the items Joe had reported missing from their home. Rachel's skull was broken in 2 places, and her face, shoulders and neck had multiple lacerations. Defensive wounds on her arms indicated she had attempted to fight off her attacker. She had been hit between 6 and 9 times, and blood in her airways suggested she had struggled to breathe. There's nothing specific enough about the injuries to identify an actual weapon. All I could see was something fairly heavy to cause the damage to the skull, certainly something like a dumbbell, anything that is heavy enough and wielded with enough force. The force that they have to use to produce those injuries is pretty enormous. A couple of days after the murder, the police searched Joe's office and seized his laptop. This deepened the investigation, as every clue pointed away from a random burglary and towards a more personal, violent attack. A series of deleted emails were recovered by the police revealing Joe's deep hatred for Rachel. In conversations with his sister and Joe used vulgar language and curse words to refer to Rachel, even saying she repulsed him. When these emails came to light, Rachel's family was devastated. At family gatherings, Joe would tend to separate himself from the adults and Nobody really knew much about him, but this was the last thing they expected. The house was then cordoned off for 9 days while the investigation continued. The family prepared for Rachel's burial. They decided to write letters to be placed in the coffin with her following the burial. Rachel's parents received the cards attached to the flowers, and one card stood out. Joe's card simply said, "See you later." Joe's behavior continued to raise eyebrows. The police told him he could now return to the house and make a note of anything he thought had been stolen. He repeated that some of Rachel's jewelry, a camera and 2 towels were missing, along with one of the dumbbells, but the jewelry and camera had already been found despite the house still being in disarray with Rachel's blood everywhere. Joe invited Rose and Jim over, saying there was a sense of peace and that it would be good for them to visit. Rose was hesitant, but Jim thought that if it helped Joe process what had happened, maybe it could help them too. To their shock, when they arrived, the house remained a crime scene with visible blood stains and overall chaos. Joe's insistence on bringing them back to such a where their daughter had been brutally murdered only made them feel more and more suspicious. Joe began reenacting the murder and speculating on how Rachel had been killed, even pointing to the blood spatter on the ceiling. He showed them the blood on the walls, adding that he thought the killer had stepped over her body and then cleaned up in the bathroom while listening to Rachel choke on her own blood, and that the killer had gone back into the room to finish her off when they went back downstairs. Joe insisted that they listen to the voicemails he had left for her that day. Rose later said she could hear Rachel's voice in her head saying he did it that night. Rose spoke to Jim about her feelings. Jim was distraught and asked her not to talk to anyone else, saying people reacted to grief in different ways and that Joe was just behaving as if he were in shock. Rose couldn't speak to Jim about it again because he would get so upset. Joe also started speaking to the media, claiming the family was worried that the killer could attack again. He even went on television to ask for information and address directly to the killer. A journalist interviewed Joe at the house, and before long he asked her if she wanted to see the bedroom where Rachel had been murdered. This took her by surprise, and when he pointed out where the blood had been and where she was found, it left her deeply nervous. Another journalist visited the house 12 days after the murder and took photographs, including one of Joe sitting in his kitchen. Joe mentioned that the Gardaí were treating him as a suspect. When the journalist asked if he believed he was a suspect, Joe said yes, she'd been taken unawares that this was someone that perhaps she trusted. People from the community and the couple's friendship circles called Joe to offer their condolences and asked if there was anything they could do to help. Joe would offer to show them the crime scene and explain what he thought had happened, something later referred to as the murder tours. In another interview, Joe claimed he had to meet a client that evening, but this turned out to be a lie. He instead went and visited his lover Nikki. He was on TV asking for information about the murder of his wife, and he spent the night with the woman he had been having an affair with. When news of the affair broke in the media, interest in the case only increased. One journalist noted that looking back over her interview notes, Joe hadn't actually mentioned loving his wife or how much he misses her. He spoke about how devastated the children were, but said nothing about his own feelings despite Joe and Nikki's efforts to downplay their relationship. It was becoming clear that this had been a long-term affair lasting several months. They had met while working at an advertising agency, and after a night out at a pub they swapped email addresses and mobile phone numbers to keep in contact. Joe would tell Rachel he was away for work when he was actually going to see Nikki. They spoke on the phone every day and would meet each other 2 times a week, all while Joe firmly denied everything. In December 2005, 14 months after Rachel's murder, the Guard were still working to build their case against Joe O'Reilly. At that point, everyone knew it was Joe. They just needed to find the right evidence to pin him. One crucial piece of evidence was the analysis of Joe's phone location data, which showed that his phone was pinging off a mast near his home around the time of the murder. Rachel's exhumation on March 8, 2005 also revealed something very suspicious. Joe O'Reilly had placed a letter into Rachel's coffin during her burial, which led her family to ask the police to examine it, as they suspected that Joe might have written something incriminating. The note simply said, "I am sorry." But this note was considered ambiguous and not sufficient on its own. The exhumation of Rachel's body also revealed a 5-page letter Joe had written, which was chemically treated and examined using infrared technology. In one passage, Joe expressed deep love and regret, saying, "Rachel, I love you so very, very much. I cannot think what I will ever do without you, and I don't want to think. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and you will never be replaced. This is the hardest letter I've ever had to write, for reasons only we know. Rachel, please forgive me." 2 words, 1 sentence, but I will say them forever. As the guard were searching through CCTV footage, they came across a car. The car was similar to Joe's blue Fiat Punto, but the license plate was not clear enough for identification to establish that it was indeed Joe's car. On the footage, Gardaí conducted a search of all Fiat Punto drivers in Ireland, which resulted in 2,500 matches. While they couldn't eliminate every driver, they ruled out enough to strongly suggest the car belonged to Joe. The police also contacted O2 for call records, hoping to corroborate Joe's movements on the day of Rachel's murder. Although they couldn't provide specific call recordings, an engineer from France helped trace Joe's phone activity. They pinpointed which cell towers Joe's phone had accessed throughout the day, which allowed them to map his entire route. It was revealed that at 5:45 a.m. on the morning of the murder, Joe left home to go to a gym on the city outskirts, where he was supposed to meet his colleague. On his way to a petrol station, he filled up his car and received a 28-minute call from Nikki, which was the first of 8 calls they exchanged that day, despite Joe's claim that he was at Broadstone all morning. His phone's data showed it had pinged off a mass near Murphy's Quarry, which was less than a mile away from his home. Joe had also sent an email to his colleague saying his phone would be out of service for most of the morning, which contradicted his earlier statements on the morning of the murder. CCTV footage caught Rachel leaving with their 2 sons around 9 a.m. to drop them off at daycare and school. 3 minutes later, she passed by Murphy's Quarry in her car. She returned home at 9:41 a.m. and shortly thereafter it's believed she was killed. The car, believed to be Joe's, was also seen on CCTV passing Murphy's Quarry around the times relevant to Rachel's movements. Tons of evidence pointing towards Joe O'Reilly's involvement in Rachel's murder finally led to his arrest in October 2006. Joe O'Reilly arriving at Swords District Court earlier today. The 35-year-old had been arrested this morning at a house in Dunleer County Law and brought to Bal Bridgingara Station. Detective Sergeant Pat Murray told the court that at 10:55 a.m. he formally charged Mr. O'Reilly with the murder of his wife Rachel O'Reilly on October 4, 2004 at the Nolan County Dublin Gardaí recalled Joe reacting with shock when informed of his arrest at his mother's house. He was formally charged with Rachel's murder that day and entered a plea of not guilty. The trial began on June 25, 2007, drawing a huge amount of media and public interest across Ireland, and on July 21, 2007. After 9.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty despite overwhelming evidence including forensic analysis and witness testimonies. He has never admitted to the crime. The emotional scenes outside the court were described as some of the most extraordinary ever witnessed there. The courtroom erupted with cheers and applause upon the verdict. Joe O'Reilly was sentenced to life imprisonment for Rachel's murder, which marked the beginning of his incarceration at Mountjoy Prison. Rachel's family, who had gone through a long and painful journey seeking justice for their daughter, expressed heartfelt thanks to the Gardaí, the prosecution team, and the people of Ireland who supported them with cards, letters and prayers throughout the ordeal. For them, The verdict brought a sense of closure and justice for Rachel. Joe O'Reilly has been denied parole on multiple occasions. And Rachel's family is making sure that he serves his life sentence, currently incarcerated at Midlands Prison in Port Leach since 2002. After spending the first 15 years of his sentence at Dublin's Wheatfield Prison, O'Reilly has continuously sought to appeal his conviction without success. His attempts to overturn the verdict have been consistently denied by the courts. Story 4. Now we're going to be taking a look at another disturbing case with you. This one involves one of the strangest love triangles we've ever encountered. The killer in this case definitely thinks the solution to all her life's problems involves stabbing anyone she doesn't like, but as we'll see, this idea doesn't quite work in her favor. Sadly, Sheila Davila's jealousy and rage would stop at nothing and no one. But during her rampage she makes one rookie mistake that finally led to her capture. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved Annalisa Rayondo and all those affected by this case. Stamford, Connecticut. You might not have heard of it, but it's a huge business hub. It's home to 8 Fortune 500 companies and countless other big-name corporations. That makes it the region's largest financial district outside New York City itself. But it's not just finance. Stanford also thrives on real estate, tech and pharmaceuticals. And it's in pharmaceuticals that we find the story of Annalisa Rayondo. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, Annalisa grew up in a close-knit Filipino-American family with her parents Susan Renadu and her siblings. From a young age her ambition and intellect were clear to all who knew her. She went to Harvard University for her undergraduate studies. And not stopping there, she went on to obtain a master's degree from Columbia University. But it's not just her Ivy League background that charmed all who met her. Annalisa was known for her well-rounded nature, excelling in athletics and possessing a kind and humble personality. These qualities, combined with her intellectual capabilities, positioned her for success in her professional life. After graduating, Annalisa secured a position as a pharmaceutical executive at Purdue Pharma, which is an incredibly well-compensated profession. This career success allowed her to enjoy a comfortable lifestyle. She had a spacious 2-story condominium and everything she could possibly want. Not only that, but Annalisa's professional life and her personal life were beginning to collide. In a good way, she developed a romantic relationship with her colleague Nelson Sessler. Despite the differences in their personalities, the two found a connection. Annalisa was more adventurous and outgoing, while Nelson was more reserved and grounded. So it may be that opposites attract, but given their professional relationship as co-workers, they chose to keep their romantic side discreet for the time being. Nevertheless, their relationship was progressing towards a more serious commitment. They weren't talking about marriage yet, but it was developing toward that. Annalisa appeared to be thriving both personally and professionally, making the most of the opportunities presented to her. Now her story up to this point is one of achievement and prosperity, but sadly life often doesn't pan out the way we hoped. For the murder in early November 2002, Annalisa and Nelson decided on an evening out in New York City with friends. However, the couple never arrived at the destination as the evening went on. Friends attempted to contact Annalisa, but their calls went unanswered. While her friends were worrying there was something horrible taking place at Annalisa's seaside condo, someone dialed 911 and police officers rushed to the scene. Upon arrival, they discovered a gruesome scene. Tragically, Annalisa was found murdered, having suffered severe injuries consistent with a brutal attack. The front door was open and inside you could see signs of a violent struggle. The victim had been stabbed in the face and beaten in the head with a dumbbell. Annalisa Rayondo was only 32 at the time of her death. Evidence at the scene suggested that she had fought desperately for her life before succumbing to her injuries. Investigators noted the absence of forced entry, indicating the possibility that Annalisa may have known her assailant and willingly opened the door. The crime scene analysis revealed that theft did not appear to be the motive as valuables remained undisturbed in the residence. This led investigators to consider that the primary intent of the perpetrator was the act of violence itself. Forensic evidence included blood traces found not only on and around Aniza but also in the bathroom sink. This suggested that the assailant may have sustained injuries during the attack and attempted to clean up afterward, which is quite a common occurrence in crimes involving edged weapons. The investigation as a standard procedure in such cases. The investigation began by examining those closest to the victim, including her partner Nelson. This approach is typical in homicide investigations, as statistically a significant percentage of such crimes are committed by individuals known to the victim. Nelson arrived at Annalisa's condo while the police were still present, apparently completely unaware of the tragedy that took place. He said he was there to pick her up for their date, and that's when the officers had the difficult task of informing him about Aniza's murder. People noted that Nelson's first reaction to the news didn't seem distressing, but it's likely that he wasn't able to register what had happened and was too shocked to have any reaction. As the investigation progressed, police thoroughly examined Nelson's whereabouts on the day of the incident. His alibi proved to be solid. CCTV footage from Purdue Pharma confirmed his presence at work throughout the day, from his arrival in the morning to his departure in the evening. More importantly, he was seen wearing the same clothes all day, which appeared clean and free from any signs of the violent encounter that had occurred at Annalisa's residence. Given the nature of the crime scene, investigators concluded the assailant likely would have been heavily stained with blood. The fact that Nelson's clothing showed no such evidence, combined with his verifiable alibi, led investigators to rule him out as a suspect. Detectives also found no apparent motive for Nelson to harm Aniza. Their relationship, by all accounts, had been progressing positively. This turn in the investigation meant that the authorities needed to widen their search and consider other potential suspects or leads in their effort to solve this distressing case. The mysterious 911 call. The call had come from a payphone just down the street from Aniza's house. The woman calling didn't give her name and abruptly hung up. The crime scene was discovered because of a 911 call, but who informed the police? It's something that surprisingly no one could figure out. This call, made by an unidentified individual, reported an attack on a neighbor. However, there were many strange details about this call. Firstly, the caller did not identify themselves, which is not uncommon in emergency situations, but still something to note. More importantly, they provided an incorrect address for the incident. Despite this mistake, law enforcement quickly located Annalisa's residence because the door was open. When attempts were made to follow up with the caller, it was discovered that the call came from a payphone near a local restaurant close to Annalisa's home. This detail was strange, as it suggested the caller might have some connection to or knowledge of the area. No eyewitnesses could be found who had seen anyone using the payphone at the relevant time. The police conducted thorough interviews with residents in Annalisa's building, but none matched the voice or description of the caller. The content of the call itself provided another point of interest. The caller specifically mentioned a male attacker, which gave investigators a potential lead. However, this information from an unidentified source had to be treated cautiously. Was the caller a concerned citizen who wished to remain anonymous, or could they have been involved in the incident in some way? 5 months after the tragic event, the investigation had almost stalled. The caller's identity still remained unknown, but fortunately, after this period, new developments emerged and the investigation gained a new lead in the weirdest way possible. In March 2003, approximately 5 months after Annalisa Rayondo's unsolved murder, a bizarre incident occurred at a hospital just across the New York border. About 25 minutes from Stamford, a couple arrived seeking medical attention. The husband, Paul, had multiple stab wounds to his chest. At first there were conflicting accounts of what had transpired. The wife, Sheila Dew, insisted it was an accident, While Paul provided a more unconventional explanation, he claimed they had been engaged in a sex game of sorts involving handcuffs and blindfolds, where the objective was to guess what item was being used to touch the blindfolded partner. According to Paul, the stabbing occurred during this activity, which he believed was accidental. Paul underwent emergency surgery and ultimately made a full recovery, but the circumstances surrounding the incident raised suspicions among law enforcement. How do you accidentally stab someone multiple times? It just didn't make any sense. Upon further investigation, a horrifying connection jumped out. It was discovered that after stabbing her husband, Dava didn't dial 911. Instead, she called Nelson Sessler, the same Nelson Sessler who had been Ana Zarayandu's partner at the time of her death. When questioned about this, Nelson eventually came clean and said that he had been involved in an extramarital relationship with Delu. Furthermore, Devalu was also an employee at Purdue Pharma, the same company where both Nelson and Annalisa had worked. This unexpected link between the two cases, Annalisa's unsolved murder and the stabbing of Paul Christos, was something investigators needed to establish quickly. Because of this, detectives had to reevaluate the evidence in Annalisa's case and make a closer examination of the circumstances surrounding Paul's injuries. They now faced the challenging task of determining whether these events were somehow related or if their connection was just a weird coincidence. I sat down with her. She was a polite, cooperative. He came and he said he was hurt, and he laid on the floor and he's like, "Can you look at it to see if it's bleeding?" And I get nauseous and I look at what I couldn't look at it. "Tell me about the deed, because I already know about the deed." We were just playing the game. As the investigation deepened, detectives realized there was a workplace romance that had gotten out of hand. Nelson said he had been romantically involved with both Anaza and Devalu at the same time. According to his account, his relationship with Devalu was brief, described as a summer fling, which he ended as his involvement with Annalisa became more serious. However, the true nature and depth of these relationships isn't something we know. The situation was further complicated by the fact that while Devalu was aware of Nelson's relationship with Annalisa, Annalisa appeared to have been unaware of Devalu's involvement with Nelson. Plus, after Annalisa's tragic death, Devalu rekindled her relationship with Nelson. Remarkably, Nelson claimed to be unaware that she was married to Paul during this time. No doubt the levels of secrecy and the overlapping affairs were difficult to keep track of, and as we will see later on, it created more questions than it answered. Who was Sheila Devalu? Devalu and her family are from Iran. They found refuge in the United States during the late 1970s amidst the Iranian Revolution. Settling in New York, Devalu followed in her parents' academic footsteps, studying biochemistry and eventually securing a position at a pharmaceutical company where she worked alongside Nelson and Anaza. In keeping with tradition, she entered into an arranged marriage with Farid Musvi shortly after completing her studies. However, this first marriage was short-lived, as she soon became involved with Paul Christos, whom she would later marry in 2001. Just 2 years later, she met and began a relationship with Nelson. Nelson would frequently visit Dava's residence for their secret meetings. However, circumstances were still far from normal. To create an illusion that she was single, she would tell Paul that her mentally ill brother was visiting, and he wouldn't react well to discovering her relationship with him. This made Paul gather his belongings and temporarily relocate to his parents' house. With Nelson's arrival, there would be no trace of another man living in Dava's home. It's surprising that Paul actually believed his wife's weird excuse, but this just shows how good she was at manipulating others. Now that Anaza ends up dead, Devalu is back having an affair with Nelson in no time at all. Devalu's deadly obsession. Let's revisit what happened in the hospital after stabbing Paul twice. Dava did something that could never be explained. Despite her husband's urgent pleas for help, she did not call emergency services. Instead, she contacted Nelson and remarkably invited him over for dinner while her severely injured husband remained restrained and bleeding when Nelson was unable to accept the invitation Davila finally agreed to take Paul to the hospital. However, this decision came after a critical delay of approximately an hour, during which Paul's condition likely worsened even more shockingly. Upon arriving at the hospital parking lot in Westchester, Davila allegedly stabbed Paul a third time. This time she nearly missed his heart. A search of her residence uncovered a cache of concerning items, including night vision goggles, stun guns, and a lock-picking kit. These discoveries were evidence of premeditation and raised serious questions about her intentions and activities. A chilling theory began to make more sense as the investigation went on. Dava's actions appeared to be driven by an intense, possibly delusional obsession with Nelson. Investigators began to suspect that in November 2002 Sheila had gone to Anila's home with the intent to eliminate her perceived rival, the attempted murder of her husband Paul. Months later was another step in Sheila's misguided plan to remove obstacles in her pursuit of a relationship with Nelson. The investigation now focused on building a case that could potentially solve both Analise's murder and the attempted murder of Paul Christos, with Sheila Davila as the primary suspect in both incidents. In 2007, 5 years after Analise's tragic death, Davila was arrested and charged with murder. The trial proved to be super unusual, though, as Davila opted to represent herself despite her lack of formal legal training. You'll see shortly that she demonstrated a surprising aptitude for law in court. For the most part, she challenged the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence against her. Her decision to self-represent allowed her to directly cross-examine key witnesses, including her ex-husband Paul and ex-lover Nelson. The prosecution built their case around portraying Davila as a manipulative individual driven by an obsession with Nelson. They argued that she was responsible not only for Analise's murder but also for the mysterious 911 call that misdirected the police investigation. The prosecution argued the attack on Paul was an attempt to eliminate another obstacle in her obsession with the relationship with Nelson. A crucial piece of physical evidence was a small amount of Davila's blood found on the sink in Analise's apartment. This was corroborated by a friend's testimony that Davila had a noticeable cut on her hand around the time of the murder. However, Davila challenged the timing of when this blood could have been shed, arguing that it could have been from a previous innocent visit to Analise's home. And I was like, oh my goodness, what did you do? And she said she cut it on a can of dog food. Remarkably, the voice of the anonymous 911 caller who alerted authorities to Raimundo's plight the previous November matched Davila. The caller had claimed to be a neighbor but was never identified. Her defense strategy focused on the lack of other forensic evidence linking her to the crime scene. She brought up the absence of fingerprints or hair evidence and questioned the reliability of voice identification attempts related to the 911 call. In her cross-examinations, she questioned her ex-husband about how he felt during the stabbing incident, trying to portray it as an accident or a misunderstanding rather than an attempted murder. You previously stated that when I lunged at you I looked distressed. I had a distressed look on my face. Correct. And you have previously stated that I looked kind of crazy at that time. Crazy, angry. Correct. And you have said that I never wished harm on other people, even those I disliked. Correct. But she didn't stop there. She then tried to prove that Nelson may have been the one to kill Anilis. You had lied to the police. Yes, I wasn't forthcoming to the police. And what was the nature of that lie? I hadn't told them that you had been my girlfriend in the past and we had a relationship, right? And you did that. Why? I didn't want you to go through the ordeal that I had gone through on the day of Ms. Rondo's murder. Mrs. Slaw, you had a swollen red knuckle, a red mark on the side of your face wrapping around your ear, and scratches on your back. Correct. Not to my knowledge. After 2 weeks the trial eventually ended in a guilty verdict for Sheila Davila. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison and she was already serving 25 years for the attempted murder of Paul Christos. Should she live to 110, her total sentence will end in 2079, but this isn't the last we've seen of her. In 2017, Davila would be interviewed by Piers Morgan for an episode of Killer Women, his documentary series. During the entire interview there were 3 armed guards around her, which is something Piers claims they've never had to do before. Davila insisted to a skeptical Morgan that the evidence was not the whole truth. Dressed in a simple red top, gray skirt and black tights for the cameras, the Iranian-born prisoner admitted her involvement in Christos' case but denied wanting to kill him. She also insisted she wasn't anywhere near Anilis's apartment when her then co-worker was stabbed and beaten. Davi's argument hinged on her insistence that traces of her DNA found on a faucet in Ryundo's bathroom resulted from cross-contamination by the police. She also denied the prosecution's motive, maintaining that she could have easily divorced her husband instead of killing him. Davila confessed to Piers that she couldn't fully explain her actions around the almost fatal sex game. She claimed she and Christos often engaged in consensual violence, including slapping and punching. Concluding their filmed meeting, Morgan told Davila that the saddest thing for him was her apparent self-delusion, as she had convinced herself she didn't do it. Speaking to The Sun, the TV host didn't mince words, calling her an astonishingly selfish, greedy, obsessive, devious and dishonest lunatic. The Good Morning Britain host also admitted he was terrified when he met murderer Davila's story. 5 Christmas is supposed to be the most magical and joyful time of the year, but for the Anderson family it became the most awful massacre the tiny town of Carnation, Washington has ever seen. 911 Hi, there's been a murder. There's 3 people dead that I can see right now. I just came up. She works with me inside a house. Yes, what do you see? There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend. On December 26, 2007, Linda Theo, worried when her best friend Judy Anderson didn't show up for work, went to check on her and made a horrifying discovery. Judy, her husband, their son and his wife, and even their 2 young children, just 5 and 3 years old, had all been brutally murdered. This peaceful town of barely 2,000 people had never seen anything so terrifying. What made the tragedy even stranger was that the only member of the family left alive was Michelle Anderson, Judy's daughter, who was living nearby with her boyfriend Joseph McEnroe. I'm sorry I did because I thought I had to. And yet I know that's not a very good excuse, but I'm not trying to excuse myself. I'm just trying to explain my actions. I'm sorry, I'm terrible. The Anderson family by all accounts didn't have any known enemies. They were loved and well respected in the community, which made the whole thing even more confusing. When news of the murders broke, people in town were genuinely shocked and heartbroken, wondering who could have done something so brutal, and more importantly, why. Seeing everybody die, remembering what I did, how worthless it is, how worthless I am because I killed all these people. They deserve to die. They deserve to live a lot more than I did, but they died. To even begin to understand how all of this happened, we have to first talk about the people at the center of it all, the Anderson family. This wasn't just any family in a small, close-knit town like Carnation, Washington. Everyone kind of knows everyone. Lives are often deeply intertwined, so when something this horrifying happens, it hits differently based on what witnesses and neighbors have said. The Andersons seemed like your average family, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. 60-year-old Wayne Scott Anderson, the father, held a solid, well-paying job as an engineer at Boeing. His wife, 61-year-old Judy, was a familiar face in town thanks to her job at the local post office, where she became close friends with a woman named Linda. Yes, the same Linda who later made the 911 call that brought this entire case to light. Linda wasn't just close to Judy either. She seemed to be on good terms with the entire family. Wayne and Judy had 2 children, 32-year-old Scott and 29-year-old Michelle. Now, most parents wouldn't say they had a favorite child, not out loud anyway, but people who knew the family Say it seemed pretty obvious that Scott was the golden child, whether it was because Michelle struggled more, or simply because Scott made safer choices, it's hard to say, but the tension was definitely there. Michelle always seemed to be the black sheep while Scott was building a stable life, marrying a woman named Erica, having 2 young kids, Olivia and Nathan, who were just 5 and 3 years old. Michelle's life looked very different. She still lived on her parents' property in a small trailer about 200 yards away from the main house. She didn't pay rent, worked a basic job at Target, and had a boyfriend named Joseph McEnroe, who frankly many considered a deadbeat. He was unemployed, directionless, and according to some accounts a bad influence. To make matters worse, it appeared Michelle might have been harboring deep resentment. Her brother had everything: a loving wife, 2 beautiful kids, a stable job, and the full support of their parents. Erica, Scott's wife, was also very close to Wayne and Judy. Some even believe they treated Erica more like a daughter than Michelle herself. That kind of dynamic, whether spoken or not, can eat away at someone who already feels like an outsider in their own family. On the other hand, Joseph McEnroe came from Santa Clara, California, and while he didn't grow up in Carnation like Michelle did, the two had a lot in common. His relatives described him as someone who tried hard to be liked, a quiet guy who loved video games and mostly kept to himself. He wasn't known to be aggressive or mean-spirited. In fact, people remembered him as more of a loner than anything else. But like Michelle, Joseph seemed to drift through life without a solid plan. He didn't have a stable job, no clear direction, and just seemed stuck still. Even with all those challenges, no one expected his name to ever be connected to anything violent or tragic. Digging a little deeper, though, Joseph's life wasn't as calm as it looked. He struggled with intense anxiety and often found it hard to navigate everyday situations. One thing that really stood out about him was how easily influenced he could be. He sometimes had trouble telling right from wrong, especially in stressful moments. That kind of vulnerability made him a bit of a follower, someone who could be pulled in directions he might not have gone on his own. His relationship with Michelle started in 2001 after they met through a dating app, and it quickly became one of those intense, clingy partnerships that didn't seem all that healthy. The two leaned heavily on each other, but instead of lifting one another up, it was more like they were dragging each other down. They lived together in a trailer just a couple hundred yards from Michelle's parents' home, rent-free but far from comfortable. The place was in poor condition, and with no stable income between them, they were constantly struggling to make ends meet. Joseph didn't have many friends around, and the two of them rarely seemed to interact much with the rest of the town. Now, as mentioned earlier, Joseph McEnroe didn't have the best work ethic. He rarely made the effort to find a job, and when he did manage to get one, it usually didn't last very long. Stability was practically non-existent in his life with Michelle. Meanwhile, Michelle couldn't help but compare their situation to that of her parents, Wayne and Judy Anderson, who were both doing just fine financially, but instead of feeling supported or proud, Michelle felt overlooked, like her parents were intentionally keeping her at arm's length. She believed they weren't doing enough to help her, especially considering they'd brought her into the world. That's how she saw it anyway. Eventually, after letting her and Joseph live rent-free on their property for years, her parents decided it was time to start charging rent, and Michelle didn't take that well. She felt like they were turning their backs on her, and to make matters worse, she also claimed that her brother Scott had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from her over the years, around $40,000, she said, and had never made any real effort to pay her back. Now, despite all these hardships, Michelle and Joseph were surprisingly the ride-or-die type. They were totally committed to each other, always sticking together no matter how rough life got. They even dreamed of running off to Las Vegas to get married someday, but first they felt like they had some unfinished business to settle with Michelle's parents, Wayne and Judy. It turned out Joseph had quietly bought 2 guns back in the summer of 2006. A Smith & Wesson Model 19 Magnum revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Those weapons were no joke then on Christmas Eve of 2007 instead of joining the family celebration. Michelle and Joseph showed up at Wayne and Judy's house with a deadly plan. Judy was in the back room carefully wrapping presents for her grandkids, trying to keep the holiday spirit alive, while Wayne was somewhere else in the house getting things ready. But behind that peaceful scene, chaos was creeping in. Joseph kept a gun hidden in his waistband to distract Judy with small talk, while Michelle moved quietly toward her dad. With her own gun drawn, she aimed and tried to pull the trigger, but her gun jammed. Panic set in. Joseph quickly rushed in and fired a shot that ended Wayne's life instantly. Hearing the gunfire, Judy ran into the room only to be met with bullets from Joseph. She fell screaming, and in a chilling moment Joseph apologized before putting the gun to her head and pulling the trigger. With both parents now dead, Michelle and Joseph must have realized just how badly their plan had gone wrong, but there was no turning back. They knew Scott, Erica, and the kids would arrive any minute, so they scrambled to clean up the mess. They dragged the bodies to a nearby storage shed and frantically tried to wipe away the blood with towels and chemicals, hoping to erase the horror that had just unfolded in that quiet little house. Now Michelle and Joseph did manage to make the place spotless, but it wasn't going to stay that way for long. About 45 minutes after Wayne and Judy were gunned down, Scott arrived at the house with his wife Erica and their kids. The moment he stepped inside, he saw Michelle waiting for him. Things went sideways fast when she pulled out her gun and charged at him in a desperate attempt to save his family. Scott rushed toward her, but Michelle fired 4 shots straight at him. One of those bullets pierced his neck, and just like that his life was over. Erica was hit twice in the barrage of bullets, but somehow she held on. She knew she had to do something, anything, to stop the nightmare from getting worse. That's when she spotted a cordless phone nearby. Bleeding and barely able to move, Erica crawled over to the sofa for cover, grabbed the phone and called for help. She managed to stay on the line only a few seconds before Joseph showed up and snatched the phone away. The operator heard only muffled voices and some yelling, and because she couldn't get clear info, she thought maybe it was just a noisy party getting out of hand. Still, she sent 2 officers to check things out. Hello. Meanwhile, Joseph ripped the phone apart, yanking out the batteries and crushing it under his feet. Later he admitted that Erica had been begging him the whole time, even screaming at him not to hurt the kids. All he could do was apologize again and again, but those apologies didn't stop him from finishing what he started. Joseph fired a bullet straight into Erica's head, coldly ending the second generation of the Anderson family, leaving only Michelle alive. But the horror didn't stop there. There was still the youngest generation to deal with, 2 little kids just 5 and 3 years old. You'd think after all the violence these 2 wouldn't be harmed, but that wasn't the case. Michelle looked at her niece and nephew and instantly saw them as a threat, liabilities that couldn't be allowed to live. She became terrified that if they survived, they could become witnesses in any future trial. The thought of them talking of secrets slipping out made her paranoid, so she decided they had to be silenced. But there was one problem: Michelle just couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. The thought of harming children was too much even for her, so she turned to Joseph, who must have been horrified at the suggestion, but deep down even he knew the brutal truth behind her words. Together they started rationalizing the unthinkable. They told themselves that the children would be scarred for life by what they had already witnessed, that their innocence was shattered beyond repair, and maybe in some twisted way it was kinder to put them out of their misery quickly than to let them suffer forever. It's chilling to think about how they managed to convince themselves of such a thing. Joseph went first, taking Olivia's life with a whispered apology. The little girl's eyes didn't even have time to understand what was happening before the bullet ended her. Then there was 3-year-old Nathan sitting on the floor, completely unaware, or maybe painfully aware, of the chaos around him. Nathan was playing quietly with the crushed batteries from the cordless Phone innocent and fragile. Joseph later said something haunting about this moment. Nathan looked up at him with full understanding, like the child somehow knew exactly what was about to happen. If I thought that hurting myself or killing myself or doing anything I could do would go off and bring back these people or ameliorate the pain or something, I would end with that cold detachment. Joseph pulled the trigger once more, ending Nathan's life just like his grandparents' parents and sister. The deed was done, but then Michelle realized something terrifying. Erica's 911 call had actually gone through. The line was brief, but it was enough for emergency services to be alerted. Panic set in as Michelle understood that the police would be arriving any minute now to investigate what had just happened. So quick as she could, she ran out to the dirt road that led up to the house and locked the front gate behind her, hoping to delay or deter any immediate entry. Just moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies showed up responding to the 911 call. They approached the lock gate and found it shut tight. No easy way in. They listened carefully but didn't hear any sounds of a disturbance. No yelling, no crying, nothing that would scream that something was terribly wrong. They even checked with a neighbor nearby who said they hadn't noticed anything unusual either. Without any more leads or evidence, the deputies decided to leave the scene without digging deeper. That brief quiet moment gave Michelle and Joseph the small window they needed, but deep down both of them knew they had crossed the point of no return. They were the sole survivors of a brutal massacre that claimed 6 lives, a horrific act that would forever stain their lives. And despite living just a couple of hundred yards from the crime scene, the police quickly identified Michelle and Joseph as persons of interest. It wasn't a matter of if they'd be suspected, it was when the investigators would interview them again and again, slowly unraveling the story, and eventually the truth would become impossible to hide. Whether it was out of clear-headed calculation or just desperate panic, Michelle and Joseph didn't stick around to face the music. They fled, making a run for the Canadian border in hopes of disappearing, but somewhere along the way they realized that escaping north might not be their best bet after all. Instead they turned west and headed to Oregon, choosing a different path in hopes of shaking the law off their trail. This meant they had to pass right by Wayne and Judy's property, the very scene of their crime. It's chilling to imagine whether they took a moment to look back to see the aftermath of what they'd done back in Carnation on December 26, 2 days after the murder. Linda Thela, Judy's best friends, started to worry when Judy didn't show up at the post office like she always did. It was totally out of character for Judy, who was punctual and rarely took sick days. Concerned, Linda went over to Judy's house to check on her. Peering through the window, she was met with a sight no one should ever have to see: 2 lifeless bodies lying on the floor. That moment marked the beginning of a nightmare for the whole community, as the horrifying truth of that Christmas Eve massacre slowly came to light. The first 2 bodies she saw were those of Scott and Erica, but in her shock and confusion she initially thought they were Wayne and Judy. Her mind struggled to make sense of the horror in front of her. At that moment Linda had no clue that every person inside that house had been shot, executed in cold blood. Instead, her first assumption, as strange as it may sound now, was that maybe it had been some kind of tragic accident, carbon monoxide poisoning. She thought that would at least make some sense, but once she stepped through the doorway and into the house, the truth hit her like a freight train. The signs of violence were everywhere: gunshots, blood, the unmistakable scent of death, and any illusion of an accident vanished completely. Distraught, shaking, and barely able to process what she was seeing, Linda called the police. Her voice trembled as she described what she just found. The police swarmed in fast, setting up a perimeter around the house. Yellow tape was stretched across the property and investigators began carefully documenting the grisly scene while stunned neighbors looked on in shock. And right at that exact moment, almost like some twisted twist of fate, Michelle and Joseph happened to drive by. As mentioned earlier, they initially planned to flee to Canada but changed course and were headed to Oregon. Still, something made them stop. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at their conscience, or maybe they just wanted to see what kind of chaos they'd left behind. Whatever the reason, they pulled over, stepped out of the car, and were quickly approached by police. It didn't take long before officers became suspicious. Michelle and Joseph were too close to the scene, too calm, and their timing was just too perfect. They were brought in for questioning. And from there everything started to fall apart. At first the couple tried to lie their way out of it. They spun a ridiculous story saying they were heading to Las Vegas to get married, but it was flimsy. And they both knew it. The weight of what they'd done was crushing them. The pressure finally broke Michelle first. She collapsed in tears during interrogation and confessed. She sobbed through the confession, struggling to speak but wanting to get it all out. Meanwhile, Joseph stayed quiet. He insisted he was innocent, but that didn't save either of them. Both Michelle and Joseph were formally charged with 6 counts of first-degree homicide for the deaths of Wayne, Judy, Scott, Erica, and the 2 little children, Olivia and Nathan. The initial investigation proceeded rapidly, but the actual trial would not begin until almost 3 years later. This delay was due in large part to pre-trial motions, psychological evaluations, and the complexity of the evidence that had to be carefully analyzed and verified. The trial officially kicked off in the summer of 2008 when both defendants were formally arraigned and prosecutors laid out the horrific details of the case. During these early court proceedings, Michelle initially denied full involvement, but the mounting pressure combined with the overwhelming evidence, ranging from forensic reports to phone records and chilling witness testimonies, eventually led her to a dramatic confession. It was in late 2008, several months into the trial, that Michelle broke down in tears on the witness stand and admitted she was the mastermind behind the massacre. Meanwhile, Joseph McEnroe maintained his claim that Michelle was the controlling force behind the murders, portraying himself as someone manipulated into complicity. However, prosecutors methodically dismantled this defense over the course of the trial, presenting evidence that showed Joseph was an active participant. Despite his claims, the jury was persuaded by the prosecution's argument that both Michelle and Joseph shared responsibility for the horrific acts. The community followed every twist with heavy hearts and growing impatience as the trial stretched on month after month. By early 2009, the prosecution was pushing hard for the death penalty. The 6 counts of first-degree homicide carried the possibility of the harshest punishment available under Washington state law. Prosecutors painted a picture of cold-blooded killers who had shown no remorse and had carried out a meticulously planned and savage attack on their own family members, including 2 young children. Public opinion was largely in favor of the death penalty, reflecting the anger and grief felt by many in the community. Yet on January 31, 2013, after years of hearings, the presiding judge Jeffrey announced a surprising decision. The death penalty was off the table for both defendants, citing evidentiary and procedural considerations. The judge ruled that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would be the maximum sentence. While many expected capital punishment for such a brutal crime, the law required careful adherence to rules ensuring fairness and due process. The lengthy wait for a resolution had frustrated some, but it underscored the complexities of administering justice in the most serious cases. Realizing that the death penalty was no longer a looming threat, but that life imprisonment was inevitable, Joseph McEnroe changed his strategy. In the months following the judge's decision, he pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of first-degree homicide, which was a move intended to avoid any further legal battles that might have prolonged the process. In his plea, McEnroe reiterated his earlier defense that Michelle had dominated their relationship and influenced his actions, but the court was unsuited. His courtroom demeanor and the overwhelming evidence sealed his fate. Michelle Anderson, on her part, accepted full responsibility, showing deep remorse and calling herself a monster. During the sentencing phase, she expressed sincere regret for the pain she caused, acknowledging the Unimaginable devastation she inflicted on the family and community despite her. Pleas. The judge made it clear that the law demanded a strict sentence for such heinous crimes finally in mid-2013 after nearly 8 years of legal proceedings since the murders. Both Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe were formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the gravity of their crimes and the need for society's protection from such violent offenders. Ms. Anderson: the result is pretty much preordained. Ms. Anderson, pursuant to your convictions, the law mandates that I impose 6 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of release or parole, plus a sentence of enhancement of 60 months on each count as well. I will impose the mandatory victims assessment penalty. The DNA fee restitution will be set at a separate proceeding which you may waive your presence at if you so desire. I will waive all other non-mandatory fees and assessments, and that will be the order of the court. But no matter how much justice has finally been served, the horrific memories of that terrible night still haunt everyone involved. What's truly heartbreaking is that there's no one left to mourn the Anderson family anymore except for the very people who took their lives and a handful of close friends who managed to survive the nightmare. One of those friends, Linda, had to relieve the trauma again and again throughout the entire trial, forced to revisit the worst day of her life in vivid detail while testifying, making sure the pain stayed etched into her memory forever. The small town of Carnation hasn't been the same since that awful Christmas Eve. To this day you can bet that locals still whisper about the horrors that happened in that big house just up the road. The mobile home and the storage shed where it all unfolded still stand silent witnesses to a nightmare that changed the community forever. It's like a shadow hanging over the place, a dark chapter that no one really wants to talk about but can't forget. Story 6: what would you do if the person you trusted most suddenly became your greatest threat? A simple knock at the door set off a chain of events so chilling it would shatter a family's world and haunt a community forever. A lone survivor versus a man thirsty for blood. Who would win? What would drive someone to annihilate an entire family? Parents, children, all of them in the comfort of their own home. July 9, 2014 was supposed to be like any other summer day in the quiet suburbs of Spring, Texas. The sun was out. Kids were home from school and families were tucked away in their safe tree-lined neighborhoods, but that calm was shattered when police were called to a horrifying scene inside a modest brick house on Leaflet Lane. Inside they discovered the bodies of 6 family members, 2 adults and 4 children, all executed in cold blood. Only one person had survived, barely clinging to life. It wasn't a robbery, nothing was stolen. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate motive, and no suspects fleeing the scene, just a question that hung heavy in the humid Texas air. The Stay family had no known enemies, so who could have done this? Let's rewind to that July afternoon. Back to the front door of the Stay family's home on Leaflet Lane, a man shows up dressed as a FedEx delivery worker, clipboard in hand, uniform, convincing, calm expression, nothing alarming, just a guy delivering a package. In the middle of the day, the girl who answers the door, Cassidy Stay, sees a familiar face but she can't quite place it. When he asks for her parents, she explains they aren't home, so he leaves, but he comes back. This time he drops the act. No more FedEx persona. He tells Cassidy who he is, her ex, Ronald Lee Haskell, her mother's sister's former husband. The moment she tries to shut the door, everything spirals. Haskell forces his way in. Suddenly the quiet safety of a suburban home is replaced with panic. He overpowers Cassidy, ties her up and makes her lie face down on the floor, and he waits. It gets worse. One by one the rest of the family comes home. Stephen and Katie Stay and their 4 children, each of them is ambushed, bound and forced to the ground alongside Cassidy. No chance to fight back, no time to run. What they didn't know was that Haskell wasn't there to talk or to threaten. He was there for blood. When they didn't give him the answers he wanted, where was his ex-wife? Why had she left him? He didn't hesitate. With cold, calculated cruelty, Haskell shot each of them in the back of the head execution style. He fired at the whole family one after the other 13 shots in total. Just like that, he tried to erase an entire family, and yet he failed because Cassidy, despite being shot herself, didn't die. The bullet shattered part of her skull and took off the tip of her finger, but somehow she stayed conscious, and then she did something extraordinary. She played dead perfectly. Haskell believed he'd finished the job and fled the scene in the family's car, thinking he'd silenced every witness, but Cassidy got up bloodied and broken. She managed to call 911, and through sheer will she told the police everything: who the killer was, what he looked like, and most importantly where he might be going next. Haskell hadn't come to Spring just to kill the Stays. He was planning on finishing what he started by hunting down more of his ex-wife's relatives. Thanks to Cassidy, the police moved fast. They found Haskell driving toward another family member's home. What followed was a tense 20-minute car chase through suburban streets, sirens screaming behind him. Eventually police laid down spike strips, disabling his vehicle and trapping him in a cul-de-sac just a few miles from the stay home. He wasn't done yet though. He held a pistol to his head and began a tense standoff that lasted hours as negotiators tried to coax him out. Without more bloodshed, finally he surrendered, and as he was taken into custody, the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. A man so consumed by anger, so blinded by vengeance, that he tried to annihilate an entire family. But even in all that darkness there was one light: Cassidy, a teenager who refused to die, who outwitted a killer, and who made sure justice had a chance to catch up. Let's talk about the family, the Stay family. The ones whose lives were stolen in the most heart-wrenching way imaginable, because this wasn't just a headline about 6 victims. These were real people: a loving husband and wife, bright, happy children, a close-knit family that had simply opened their door to someone they thought would fit like a missing piece in a puzzle. Stephen Stay, 39, was a husband and father first, but also a hard-working man who ran his own real estate business. He and his wife Katie, 33, had moved their family from California to Texas in 2012, hoping for a fresh start. They chose Spring because it was safe, quiet, and full of promise. What they couldn't have known was that the past they left behind would follow them there with deadly intent. Then there were their children, 4 beautiful souls, each with their own dreams, quirks, and smiles that could light up a room. Brian, 13, the oldest of the children who were killed, had just begun navigating his teenage years. He was a student at Schindwolf Intermediate School, known to be kind-hearted, bright, and helpful. Emily, only 9, and Rebecca, 6, were both pupils at Lem Elementary School. They were inseparable sisters, full of energy and curiosity. And Zachary, just 4 years old, the baby of the family, was still learning how to tie his shoes and say his ABCs. They were the kind of family you'd see at the grocery store laughing over cereal boxes, the kind of family that decorated their lawn for Halloween and held backyard birthday parties. They were ordinary in the most extraordinary way, but somehow, or miraculously as we should say, there was one survivor. Cassidy Stay, the amazing teenager, was a student at Klein Collins High School. She was the girl who answered the door that day, the one who looked a killer in the eye, the one who was shot in the head, who lost her parents and all 4 of her siblings, and who still found the strength to call 911 and warn the police that her attacker wasn't done. Cassidy wasn't just lucky to survive, she was also heroic. Because of her, more lives were saved. Because of her, the horror stopped there. My family always said that you only felt sorry for yourself, and I didn't want to believe that, because I thought surely he has to feel bad for killing my family. And when I heard that you felt no remorse, something changed inside of me, and I didn't know what to do with that change, and it was causing me a lot of hurt and anger, because that was my closure. My closure was the hope that you would feel bad, and the world noticed within days. Cassidy became a symbol of resilience. People across the country were moved by her courage, and a GoFundMe campaign set up in her name drew over 16,000 donors, raising more than $400 to help her rebuild what was left of her life. She was released from the hospital just 2 days after the shooting. Her physical wounds still raw, her emotional ones barely beginning to form, but she stood tall. She spoke publicly, and in one of the most powerful moments to follow the tragedy, Cassidy quoted Harry Potter's Albus Dumbledore saying, "Happiness can be found even in the darkest of times if one only remembers to turn on the light." Now let's pull back the curtain on the man behind the massacre. Ronald Lee Haskell Jr., a name now etched in infamy, but before he became a national headline, he was just another face in the crowd, a kid from San Marcos, California, a teenager who wore a crown at prom and cracked jokes in class, voted class clown and homecoming king. Haskell didn't exactly fit the mold of a future mass murderer. On the surface he was social, even likable, someone people remembered for his sense of humor, not his violence. But that's the thing about people like Haskell, what you see on the outside rarely tells the whole story. After high school, his path wounded through several states. He lived in Alaska for a time and eventually settled in Utah, where he married Melanie K. Lyon in 2002. From the outside they looked like any other young couple trying to build a life. They had roots in the same religious community that connected them to the state, family church gatherings, family photos, shared holidays. It was all part of the fabric that once held these families together. But behind closed doors things were unraveling. By the time Haskell was in his early 30s, the cracks in his marriage had turned into deep fractures. His behavior reportedly became erratic and controlling, and his relationship with Melanie grew toxic. She eventually left him, finalizing their divorce on Valentine's Day of 2014, just 5 months before the massacre. Melanie didn't just leave the marriage, she fled the state, relocating to Houston with the help of her sister Katie Stay. That move would later cost Katie her life. Haskell, meanwhile, was spiraling. He stopped working as a delivery driver for a FedEx contractor months before the attack. His life had no clear direction, no job, no family, no anchor, and yet in his mind he wasn't the problem, everyone else was. He saw himself as a victim, blaming his ex-wife, her family, and anyone who helped her escape him. The rage from his wife leaving the house turned into a heinous plan. He wasn't just seeking revenge, he wanted to destroy every part of the life Melanie had rebuilt without him, and that meant destroying the people who had helped her, the stays of family who had once welcomed him in, a family who in his mind had become his enemies. Ronald Lee Haskell didn't snap overnight. His violence was calculated, premeditated, dressed in disguise, and armed with a plan. He crossed a line he could never come back from. The quiet kid with the prom crown was gone. In his place stood a man who believed his pain gave him permission to end lives, and he nearly did. But to really understand this tragic story, let's take a closer look at his life and past. Maybe then we'll see how things ended up leading to such a heartbreaking and violent end. Long before he ever pulled a trigger, Ronald Haskell was already showing signs of who he really was. Behind the smile and the prom crown, his marriage to Melanie Lyon wasn't just falling apart quietly, it was cracking under the weight of violence, and not just arguments or harsh words, but physical abuse that left his wife terrified enough to seek legal protection. Back in June 2008, while living in Utah, Haskell was arrested after an especially brutal incident. According to reports, he dragged Melanie out of bed by her hair and struck her on the side of her head, all while their children were present. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just a domestic dispute, this was violence committed in front of his own kids. When questioned, Haskell tried to downplay it, claiming he had only pushed her, but the physical and emotional damage said otherwise. He was charged with domestic violence, simple assault, and violence in the presence of children. Ultimately, he entered a plea deal, guilty to simple assault, not guilty to domestic violence. The more serious charges were dropped. It's the kind of legal compromise that sadly often leaves victims unprotected and abusers unchecked. Fast forward to July 2013, just A year before the murders, and Melanie Lyon was still trying to shield herself and her children from his reach. She filed a protective order on July 8. It was served the very next day, but it wouldn't last. By August, Melanie had officially filed for divorce, and by October the protective order was dropped in favor of a mutual restraining order. Negotiated through the divorce and custody proceedings, it was a legal trade-off that gave Melanie primary custody of their 4 children while Haskell moved back in with his parents in San Marcos, California. He was out of her life but not out of her thoughts. She knew what he was capable of. That fear followed her even across state lines. When he showed up at the Stay family's home in Texas, Haskell was still carrying a California driver's license. He had made a deliberate trip. This wasn't a man who acted on impulse, it was a man who had been stewing for months, maybe years, about losing control, and he was now determined to take it back in the most twisted, unforgivable way. The system had given him a chance to walk away from his past without real consequences, but the victims of July 9 would pay for that leniency with their lives. Just when you think Ronald Haskell's story couldn't get more disturbing, there's another twist, and this one came barely a week before he'd take 6 lives in cold blood. On July 2, 2014, Haskell's own mother, Carla Jean Haskell, walked into the San Marcos Police Department. What she had to say wasn't just alarming, it was horrifying. She wanted a restraining order against her own son. Now think about that, a mother fearing her own child so much that she begged law enforcement for protection, and the reason a ferocious argument that turned into something straight out of a nightmare. According to Carla, Ronald had forced her into the garage of their home, but he didn't stop there. He tied her wrists with duct tape, strapped her to a computer chair, and held her captive for nearly 4 hours. During that time he threatened to kill not just her but his entire family. Why? Because she had dared to stay in contact with his ex-wife. That's how volatile and paranoid Haskell had become. Any perceived betrayal, even from his own mother, ignited a storm of violence. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about power, control, and punishing anyone who stood in his way. But here's where it takes a turn. Law enforcement searched for him after Carla's report, but they couldn't find him. He had vanished. No one knew that he was already on the road to Texas, already plotting what would become one of the most shocking family massacres in recent U.S. history. The warning signs had been flashing like neon. His own mother had sounded the alarm, but it was too late. By the time police caught up with Ronald Lee Haskell, 6 members of the Stay family were gone, and a survivor was left to tell the world what he had done. The wheels of justice began turning swiftly, at least at first. Just one day after the horrifying massacre, on the morning of July 10, 2014, Ronald Lee Haskell was formally charged with 6 counts of capital murder. Given the brutal and calculated nature of the crime, there was no hesitation. He would be facing the death penalty. But Haskell's time in court would prove to be as unsettling as the crime itself. On July 11, during his first court appearance, something strange happened. As the charges were read aloud, Haskell began to shake uncontrollably. Then, without warning, he collapsed to the floor. Deputies rushed to lift him, and he managed to stand, only to collapse again. It wasn't clear whether it was genuine shock, fear, or an act, but either way, Haskell had to be wheeled out of the courtroom. The man who had coldly executed an entire family in their own home now appeared unable to even stand and face the consequences. Over the next few months, Haskell made several appearances on September 30, December 2nd, and again on January 21, 2015, but delays would drag the legal proceedings out for years. His trial was pushed back repeatedly, expected at one point in fall of 2017, but didn't actually begin until August of 2019, 5 long years after the crime. The courtroom finally heard the full case against Ronald Haskell, and on September 26, a month later, the verdict came in guilty. Not just guilty of murder, but capital murder. The jury had no doubt About his intent, his planning, and the utmost cruelty with which he carried out the crime just 2 weeks later on October 11, Haskell was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Today he sits on death row at the Allen B. Polonsky unit near Livingston, Texas. A man who tried to destroy an entire family but failed to silence the one person strong enough to survive and speak out. Cassidy Stay. And yet as the court battles fade into memory, the most haunting part of this story remains: how many red flags were missed and how a 15-year-old girl had to become the only surviving witness to one of the worst family massacres in recent U.S. history. In the quiet aftermath of unimaginable tragedy, the community came together to mourn the loss of 6 lives stolen far too soon. The funeral for Stephen, Katie, and their 4 beautiful children, Brian, Emily, Rebecca, and Zachary, was held at the Hare Road Chapel of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was a solemn gathering filled with grief, heartbreak, and prayer. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike gathered to pay their respects, not just to say goodbye but to try and make sense of a senseless act. The Stay family had been active members of the church, and the chapel that once echoed with hymns and hope now bore witness to tears and unspeakable sorrow. Photos of the children smiling, full of life, stood near their caskets, a painful reminder of everything that had been taken. Just days later, another memorial was held at Lem Elementary School, where some of the children had been students. Their classmates left messages, drawings, and flowers. The school community, devastated and struggling to cope, created a space for remembrance and healing in a world that often forgets the victims in the shadow of the perpetrator. These moments mattered. They were a reminder that behind every headline are real people, real families, and real futures cut short. But through the darkness, one light remained: Cassidy Stay, the only survivor. Her strength and resilience would go on to inspire thousands, and while the world would never forget the horror of what happened that day in July 2014, it would also remember the bravery, the love, and the bond of a family that even death could not break. The Stay family were murdered in their own home by someone who once sat at their dinner table, someone they had once called family. 6 lives wiped out in an instant as we remember them, not just for how they died but for how they lived. One question remains as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at MR Night Cared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.